August 1, 1898, Lewiston Evening Journal, Lewiston, Maine. Martin Thorn electrocuted. The murderer of William Guldensuppe and accomplice of Mrs. Knack meets death. Was cool to the last, and apparently had no fear of death. The fatal current turned on 11:17. The last hours of a remarkable criminal. Sing Sing, August 1. Martin Thorn, the murderer of William Guldensuppe and accomplice of Mrs. Knack, was electrocuted at 11:17 this forenoon. Martin Thorn did not retire as early as usual for his last night's rest. He conversed after supper with his death watch and remained talking until nearly 11 o'clock. He slept soundly until nearly 6 this morning. Then he put on the new suit of clothing provided by the state in which to meet his death. Thorn eyed it carefully and inspected the slit in the leg where the electrode was to be applied. At 8 o'clock, Warden Sage went into the death house and talked with Thorn for a little time. When he came out, he said to the newspaper men, "Thorn told me he was not nervous and would die bravely. He said he was perfectly reconciled to his fate and that he had made his peace with his God. He slept well and had no fear of death. There is not the slightest change in his actions. He is the same cool man who came to the prison 6 months ago. His nerve is stronger than any other murderer who has been in the death house." When Thorn arose this morning, he told one of his keepers that his only dread was the wait from the time he awoke until he was summoned to the chair. Reverend Father Hosselman of Brooklyn, the spiritual advisor of the murderer, called at the prison shortly after 8 o'clock and remained with Thorn until the end. Thorn was reading the Bible when the priest entered the death house. He greeted the priest affectionately. Father Hosselman heard his confession, after which the sacraments of the church were administered to Thorn. Then he read his prayer book and prayed until the time he was summoned to the death house. The cell of Thorn in the death house was next to the door through which he passed to enter the death house. The distance from the cell to the chair of death was only 15 feet. The killing of William Guldensuppe, a bath rubber, and the subsequent mutilation and distribution of the dismembered body by Martin Thorn, a barber, and Augusta Knack, midwife, were so cunningly planned and accomplished that the crime stands alone as the most fiendish murder in the criminal history of this or any other section of the United States. On Saturday afternoon, June 26 of last year, 2 youthful swimmers found a peculiar bundle floating in East River and brought it ashore at the 11th Street dock. A policeman opened the package, which was heavy and water-soaked, and found that it contained the upper portion of a man's headless body with the arms folded across the breast, from which an irregular piece of skin and flesh had been cut with the evident purpose of removing some mark by which the part might be identified. The wrapping around the gruesome contents was made up of some red-colored table oilcloth, cheesecloth, and brown paper, and tied with stout cords. The news of the find was flashed all over this and the adjoining cities, and it was said that from the appearance of the flesh, that the body to which the piece belonged had not been dead more than 48 hours. The following day, Sunday, June 27, 2 lads, while picking berries in Ogden Woods, above the Harlem River, came across a similar bundle and rushed to the nearest police station. When this package was opened, it was found to be made up of the same sort of oilcloth and wrappings which made up the first bundle, and it contained the lower portion of the trunk minus the legs, which had been roughly cut away from it. When the two parts were put together at the morgue, it was found that they fitted exactly. 2 days later, the legs were picked up by some sailors at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. The lower limbs were also wrapped in oilcloth and cheesecloth, and before they were brought to the morgue, the authorities were satisfied that they would prove to belong to the same body as the first two portions. This proved to be correct, and the police and detectives began a search for the missing head. The police were sadly wanting in their efforts, however, and were it not for the brilliant work done by a few newspaper reporters, the crime might never have been fastened upon the perpetrators, and what seemed to be a deeply cloaked mystery was laid bare within the ensuing week. A reporter who frequently visited the Murray Hill Turkish baths was among those who examined the upper part of the body the day it was picked up, and that same afternoon he went to the baths and, without exciting any suspicion, found from the employees there that Guldensuppe, on whose breast the figure of a woman's head had been tattooed, had not been heard from since the morning of the 25th of June, the day before the first bundle was found. With this clue to work from, the newspaper man went to 439 9th Avenue, this city, where the missing man had been living with Mrs. Augusta Knack, who had been separated for some time from her husband, a bread cart driver. Further inquiries elicited the fact that Guldensuppe had a rival for the affections of the woman in one Martin Thorn, a barber, whom he had beaten and ejected from the Knack apartments a short time before. Mrs. Knack, when questioned as to Guldensuppe's whereabouts, said that the bath attendant had gone to Europe and later contradicted her story in many instances. The police arrested her on the reporter's information and found that she had made arrangements to store her furniture and leave for Germany. A sharp lookout was kept for Thorn, who had not been seen since Guldensuppe disappeared, and orders were issued by the police to arrest him on sight. Thorn had one friend, a fellow barber, John Gotha, whom he visited and confided to him his terrible secret. Gotha informed the police, and after making a double appointment with the detectives in Thorn, the latter was arrested on July 7 at the corner of 125th Street and 8th Avenue while conversing with his betrayer, Gotha. It was learned then that Thorn had walked about this city all the time, and the only attempt he had made to disguise himself was to shave off his mustache. The woman from whom the oilcloth was purchased identified Mrs. Knack as the customer to whom she sold the stuff, and Thorn and his erstwhile mistress were identified by the landlord of a cottage at Woodside, Queens County, Long Island, as having rented the house a few days before the bath rubber had disappeared. A search of this house revealed bloodstains in the bathroom and adjoining room, and from the surbase of the outer room 2 bullets were extracted. Some plaster of Paris was found in the bathroom, which later proved a telltale link in the chain of evidence against the accused, but the missing head was never discovered. Mrs. Knack and Thorn had been seen at the cottage on 2 or 3 occasions and had carried away heavy parcels from the dwelling, which they had never occupied as a residence. In due time, the prisoners were indicted for murder in the first degree in this county. Subsequently, they were indicted in Queens County and transferred to the local prison for trial. Thorn was placed on trial before Justice Wilmot M. Smith in the Supreme Court, Long Island City, on November 8 last year. District Attorney Youngs, assisted by several prominent lawyers, conducted the prosecution, and Thorn was ably defended by William F. Howe, one of the oldest criminal lawyers of the New York bar, who was assigned by the court as counsel, as the prisoner had no means to retain a lawyer. The trial was a memorable one, and the courthouse was besieged by thousands of persons who were anxious to get a glimpse of the notorious prisoners. The jury was secured on the first day, and the trial proper began on the morning of the 9th of November. Lawyer Howe declared that the prosecution could not prove a corpus delicti as long as the head had not been found, and insisted that the missing Guldensuppe was alive and enjoying himself in Germany. When court opened on Wednesday morning, the defendant's lawyers were very much perturbed when they learned that Mrs. Knack had turned state's evidence, and until the woman was called to the witness chair, Thorn refused to believe that she would betray him. For over 7 hours, Mrs. Knack sat there and told in detail her relations with both men and how she and Thorn had concocted and executed the murder of the bath rubber. All through the terrible recital, Thorn sat staring at the witness without showing any outward signs of the passions which must have been raging within. At times he smiled, and evidently enjoyed the discomfiture of the self-confessed murderess, while his counsel had her under cross-examination. In her direct testimony, Mrs. Knack said that on the morning of June 25, she induced Guldensuppe to accompany her to the woodside cottage, where Thorn was waiting to kill him, and that the parcels, which her dupe helped her to carry, contained some of the cloths, which a few hours later were used as wrappings for his hurriedly dismembered body. She told how, when they reached the cottage, Guldensuppe went upstairs to examine the house, thinking it was to be used as a baby farm, the profits from which he would divide with his paramour. She went out into the yard and stayed there until she heard a shot. Then Thorn came running down the stairs and said, "It is all over. He is dead. I shot him." Mrs. Knack returned to the city, leaving Thorn to cut up the body and place the parts in 4 parcels. One of these contained the head, which was encased in plaster of Paris in order that it would sink to the bottom of the river. She returned that afternoon, and Thorn had completed his bloody task. They carried away 2 parcels that evening. These were made up of the head and upper portion of the trunk. Coming over on a ferry boat to this city, Thorn threw these overboard. On the following day, June 27, they drove to Woodside in a 1-horse surrey and took away the other 2 bundles, and after washing away the bloodstains in the cottage, they drove back to the city again. Crossing the East River, Thorn threw the parcel containing the legs overboard, and when they reached the city, they drove to Ogden Woods, where they flung the last ghastly bundle over the parapet into the shrubbery. The details were sickening, and when the woman had concluded, one of the jurors, Magnus Larsson, was taken suddenly ill. The trial was adjourned for 2 days. It was finally decided to begin a new trial, as Larsson was too ill with appendicitis to continue the case. Stories of Thorn's evil eye, having an effect on any of whom he concentrated his gaze, began to circulate when it was learned that juror Larsson had to undergo an operation, but the talisman recovered rapidly and was able to be out of doors by the time the second trial began. On the morning of Monday, November 22, the courthouse at Long Island City was thronged with a curious crowd of spectators, and everything was in readiness for the second trial to begin, when a message was received from Justice Smith saying he was too ill to preside. Again, the theory of the evil eye of the prisoner was advanced as the cause of the judge's indisposition, and many were guessing as to who would be the next victim. Someone sent a charm to District Attorney Youngs, which the sender assured the persecutor would protect him against all evil influences. Lawyer Howe and his assistant, Joe Moss, said they had no misgivings about hoodoos and were only interested in their client, who, they said, would prove that Mrs. Knack, and not he, was the guilty person. Towards noon, a messenger arrived with the information that Justice Samuel T. Maddox would try the case, and at 1 o'clock the learned judge arrived. The work of procuring a jury was then begun, and during the afternoon, 7 men had been sworn in as jurors. Early the following day, the jury was completed, and it was then announced that the prosecution would not put Mrs. Knack on the stand. The evidence produced at the abortive trial was reproduced with this exception, and Gotha, when he told the story of Thorn's confession to him, corroborated in many ways the story which Mrs. Knack had told 12 days previously. The defendant's lawyers were compelled to change their line of defense and decided to put Thorn on the stand to testify that Mrs. Knack did the killing and that he only helped to dispose of the body. The people's case closed on the afternoon of Friday, November 26, and an adjournment was ordered until Monday, November 29. Thorn's story in the witness chair was told in a matter-of-fact way, and the prisoner never lost his coolness and self-possession for a moment. He denied Gotha's story and said that on Friday, June 25, he went to the woodside cottage to meet Mrs. Knack. She met him at the door and said, "I left Guldensuppe upstairs." "What is he doing here?" asked Thorn angrily. "Oh, he is dead," replied the woman. "I shot him, and I am now rid of all my troubles, but you must help me to do away with the body." Thorn said he went upstairs and helped Mrs. Knack to drag the dead body into the bathroom. They placed it in the tub, and Thorn held it while Mrs. Knack did the cutting. Then he described how they disposed of the bundles. With the exception of the few witnesses as to character, Thorn was the only witness on his own behalf. When the case was given to the jurymen, they retired, and after 3 hours' deliberation, during which 7 ballots were taken, with 11 for conviction and 1 for acquittal, they agreed on a verdict of murder in the 1st degree. This was on November 30, and on December 3, Thorn was sentenced to die by electricity in Sing Sing during the week beginning January 10 this year. Lawyer Howe stayed the death proceedings by appealing the case, but the Court of Appeals affirmed the verdict of the other court and fixed the date of execution for the week beginning August 1. Under the new law, it was not necessary to bring Thorn from the prison to the county in which he was convicted, and he has remained in the death house at Sing Sing since Saturday, December 4. Early last January, Mrs. Knack was allowed to plead guilty to manslaughter and was sentenced to 15 years imprisonment, which she is now serving in Auburn Prison. The lenient manner in which the self-confessed murderess was treated by the authorities was a surprise to many. She will regain her freedom in about 12 years.